Hello chess friends and welcome to your chess channel and welcome back to the World Chess Championship in 2021. So we are following now of course the epic battle between the challenger Jan Nepomniachtchi and the world champion Magnus Carlsen. Yesterday it was the easy draw I think for Magnus Carlsen, and when we watched the game in the round one, I think Magnus Carlsen could be really more satisfied than Jan Nepomniachtchi because it was a clear draw I think for Magnus Carlsen. I think in one particular moment Magnus took over and then he played really normal calm moves, had the slight advantage, and then of course Jan Nepomniachtchi had to do this perpetual trick and managed to get a draw. So it was I think very important to say that Magnus Carlsen didn't have a huge advantage, because maybe if you have a maybe +2 advantage and then you make a draw, then you're not satisfied, but it was a slight advantage for Magnus Carlsen. I think he felt very good in the middle game stage, then eventually agreed to a draw. So as I said, in my opinion, when it comes to psychology, after the day one, Magnus Carlsen had a slight advantage. So let's check out now what happened in the round two. In the round two, I think you witnessed really one of the most epic battles in World Chess Championship history, because this game is really incredible. The Catalan was on the board, and I think the last time when we watched the Catalan game in the World Chess Championship, it was a game played by Vicianand against Topalov. I think when it comes to Catalan opening, Vicianand was really the master. I really enjoyed the World Chess Championship between Topalov and Anand, in which I think we have seen really some beautiful and brilliant tactics. This game was even sharper because Magnus Carlsen here, I think, went into a wild line of the Catalan, and of course when you play wild games against Nepo, then many things can happen. Let's check out now the game. As I said, it was really beautiful and incredible game. So here Magnus opened with the move d4, knight to f6 by Nepo. We have now c4, and after the move e6, we're announcing of course after knight to c3 that we want probably to go into the Nimzo Indian. But okay, many times now in top grandmasters, the anti-Nimzo or the counter Nimzo Indian is played with the move knight to f3, delaying the move knight to c3, because we're waiting now a bishop move by black, and then when that happens, then finally we want to play knight to c3. So here in the continuation we have now d5. So Nepo transposes into the normal queen's gambit decline, and as I said yesterday also, in the first round we had a Rui Lopez, in the second round we have now the queen's gambit decline. So these are the most drawish opening, these are the most popular and most often played openings. So that's why you will not see now maybe a Trompovsky attack or something in the World Chess Championship, maybe in the later stage, but now you see they're applying the normal openings, the most popular openings in the world. So here after move d5 we have now g3. Magnus goes now into a sharper line. Of course the main lines are basically the move g3 or knight to c3. Knight to c3 leads into more classical systems, the queen's gambit decline, maybe Ragozin can happen, or I don't know, maybe the Harvard's attack, maybe I don't know, the 3 knights variation like this. So many things can happen, but after move g3, it's I think sort of a line in which white is deciding more what's going on the board. That's I think the beauty of the Catalan, because I think when you play the Catalan, black can play a response to the Catalan, has to play I think a response. But when you play a queen's gambit decline or with the move knight to c3, then your opponent is basically choosing what is going to play, maybe normal systems with bishop to e7, or maybe the Ragozin, or maybe the Fianchetto defense with b6. So as I said, I think the Catalan is more direct than the normal queen's gambit decline. So that's why here already I liked Magnus Carlsen's choice, because yesterday he played a very sharp line in which he sacrificed the pawn in the early stage of the game. Now he's saying also, I want to play a sharp game, I want to play an open game, I want to show you that I can beat you also in a tactical battle. So that's why I really loved now the world champion's choice. Here g3, bishop to e7, we have now bishop to g2, Carlsen, and now comes the move d takes c4. Many times you see this particular line. It seems in the beginning that it's risky, because of course what we can notice always in the structures that first of all they're asymmetrical and they're imbalanced, because in the near future what white wants to do is of course connect two pawns here in the center. So the main advantage that white is of course is the pawn center. Of course then black has a pawn majority advance on the queen side. But what you should do, you have to recapture the pawn, or you have to play an active game here from white's perspective. If you don't have an active game, or if you don't recapture pawn, then you have a bad game in the Catalan. So that's are your two choices. So you can have a huge activity that can happen without taking the pawn on c4, or at least you have to take a pawn and go into more, maybe more positional line. So here in the continuation we have queen to c2. Magnus is attacking the pawn immediately. Now comes the move b5. Now the most popular line is the move b5, and I think Magnus chooses again a much sharper line than going maybe into position lines, because here the main line would be something like a4, undermining the pressure. And the problem is now a potential c6 is a suicide here, because we can play immediately a takes b5, and after c takes b5 the problem is now this move, knight to g5. You cannot cover, that's the main issue. You cannot cover here the long diagonal for the light square bishop, because you have left the defense of the h7 pawn and you will be checkmated. So that's why here after move knight to e5 immediately Magnus Carlsen rushed, I think, more into the attack, and here Nepo plays a brilliant move, which is now basically the main line of the Catalan defense. I think of the Catalan opening here, the move c6 is a brilliant defense, because if you want to take it, but it's not a problem here. After move knight to c6 you can take bishop to c6, but now I think with the move rook to b8 black has solved now all of the positional problems. You see now the pawn on b5 is protected, and in the near future we can expect, of course, bishop to b7, where white I don't think has anything anymore. White will have to trade off the light square bishop for the light square bishop, because the light square bishop in Catalan is simply the best piece. In a couple more moves this bishop will be traded, so it's not a pleasant position, I guarantee you, here for white. Meanwhile, we can, I think, agree that this is a brilliant now opportunity here for black just to push the pawns, having this 3 versus 2 pawn majority. So that's why, as I said, maybe instead of this move knight to e5 immediately, you have to play a4, undermining the pressure immediately, forcing your opponent maybe to weaken the pawn structure further, and then afterwards you can always play the knight to e5. But Magnus, I think he has this prepared at home. He wanted to really create dynamics. Knight to e5, now we have c6. We have seen knight to c6 is not bringing anything. So here in the continuation a4, it is a little bit a different move order, but now you see after move a4, here comes this idea knight to d5. Knight to d5 is always a good defensive strategy to build your defense around the square d5, because Magnus Carlsen with the move a4 has already advanced the pawn and you cannot protect anymore your b4 square. So that's why knight to d5 is now a brilliant move. Now this knight to g5 tactic is not working, because the knight is already on e5. So these are the tiny little things in the opening stage. I think we have to cover many lines, because we want to understand really ideas here by Magnus, ideas also by Nepo. Here after move knight to d5 we have now knight to c3 by Magnus Carlsen, which again wasn't maybe really maybe the most accurate of lines. Here maybe a takes b5 should be maybe a better continuation. After c takes b5, now knight to c3, because now this idea here knight to b4 couldn't work, because after queen to e4 everything is good together, and you lose probably the piece. You cannot even get even back. So here, and after knight to d5 you lose again the d5 pawn. So here after move as I said, a takes b5 and c takes b5, which Magnus should have played, and knight to c3, you can maybe kick away the knight from here from the center of the board, but now queen to e4 is again the counterattack. I think maybe in the opening stage Magnus missed it, or Magnus didn't want to play this line because he knows what's going on the board. But now after queen to e4, the problem is now here you have to play knight to b6 in order to protect your rook, but now with the knight to g4 and maybe potential f5, everything is not good here anymore for black, because still we can play, of course, queen to e5 and open the long diagonal. So these are really wild tricks already in the opening. So that's why here in the continuation, after potential f6 and queen to e4, here knight to b6, of course, and then afterwards after knight to g4, bishop to d7 should probably now solve all of the positional problems here for black. So that's why I think Magnus was familiar maybe with this particular line, didn't want to play it, didn't want to rush into things, and he played here a provocative move knight to c3 immediately instead of this a takes b5. After move knight to c3, here f6 anyway by Nepo, and here knight to f3, we have queen to d7. Maybe here Nepo should have played b4. I like this line. Maybe also Nepo is familiar with this particular line. b4 I like, because many times in the Catalan and in these types of structures, when you take out the d takes c4 pawn, then of course after move b4 you weakening the c4 pawn. But now after tempo, maybe knight to e4 can be played. You can play this line, bishop to a6, and everything is glued together. You see the knight is centralized, the bishop is protecting at least for a while this pawn. In the near future future maybe we can also try b3, kicking away the queen. What I like here about this position, that finally the light square bishop is coming into the game. Many times in the Catalan opening, black has problems to develop the light square bishop. At least on this diagonal, it's not maybe the best of bishops, but at least now the bishop in a6 is doing something. At least it's protecting it. In the meanwhile, we can play b3, as I said afterwards, some ideas like b3 or even c3 if the position allows it. So here after move knight to f3, queen to d7 was played instead of this b4 move. Here Nepo wanted to, of course, protect further the e6 pawn and then maybe to play much more freely with the queen. So we have now e4 here by Magnus Carlsen, kicking away the knight to b4. As we said in the beginning, a4 is advanced. Now black can use the b4 square in order to make further progress, and what black is also doing is targeting the d3 square. So here Magnus played now a queen to e2, and now comes one of the critical moments of the game. Here Nepo, I think, rushed into this knight to d3 outpost, because still you have to protect your d5 square. The d5 is sort of a square that we're battling here for in the Catalan opening. So now with the move knight to d3, Nepo left a little bit the defense. Maybe more positional idea is to play knight to a6. Finally get your pieces into the game. If of course white wants to take, then of course after c takes b5, again we have solved all of the positional problems. You see the knights are glued together, they cannot be attacked easily, and now with the move bishop to b7 we can again compete on this long diagonal. Maybe in long runs we can also open here the position with the move f5, maybe try to really create pressure against this pawn. So that's why after maybe knight to a6, white should probably play here very aggressive move d5. After something like b takes a4, then of course we have here maybe this opportunity, d takes c6, and now after queen to d3, again I think black solves all of the positional problems. But here if you want to play a different line, if you maybe want to take in the center, that's not good because you lose simply this pawn with a takes b5, and here everything is pretty much attacked. After knight to c7 you see here e takes d5, e takes d5, but I like about this idea here with knight to d4, and I think white can have really a great square for the centralized knight, and finally open also the light square diagonal for the light square bishop. So that's why as I said, knight to d3 a little bit rushed, because you're not controlling anymore the d5 square. You have to struggle, you have to battle for this square, and Magnus Carlsen played now the move e5, because as we said, now the knight cannot jump on that square and secure this long diagonal. The knight moved a different, created a different path. Now after knight to c1, I don't think you gained anything, because after rook to c1, I think we got rid of our bad bishop, because the bishop on c1 was actually not such a good piece here for Magnus Carlsen. So after move e5, Magnus played now so far a good middle game, because he's finally liberating this long diagonal. Now a maneuver knight to b4, knight to d5 is a little bit too slow in order to secure the long diagonal. So here Nepo, that's why plays move bishop to b7. He wants now to compete on the long diagonal. We have now e takes f6, which is a good choice I think for Magnus Carlsen, because he wants now to get use of the e5 square. So far this e5 was taken by the f6 pawn. The problem is now if you play g takes f6, then of course bishop to h6 will happen, and then finally this bishop comes into the game. We can in the near future attack the knight with knight to e1, then we're challenging simply. If the knight is taken, then we can get use of the e file with rook to e1. It's I think a pleasant game then for white. So that's why you have to control this position with the bishop. So that's why bishop to f6, and now knight to e4. Magnus Carlsen played here still a good move. Knight to e4 is basically attacking the best pieces of blacks here. The problem is now you see the knight, the bishop is attacked, and in the near future, as we said, the bishop will be also attacked. If you play bishop to d4, it's not so good. Knight to d4 here can be taken after queen to d4. Then I think again this c takes b5 idea followed with bishop to e3. I think all of the pieces will get into the game. So here I think black has huge problems. The game becomes open. White has the bishop pair, so it could be now huge problem. So in the continuation, after move knight to e4, now comes the critical moment of the game. So Nepo realized that he doesn't have to battle anymore here for the dark squares. He had to develop the pieces, because he has a lack of development. The knight is not playing, so at least he develops it here to a6. And here Magnus Carlsen plays now a huge inaccuracy, I think, here with the move knight to e5. Again, maybe here the idea, knight to f6, then after g takes f6, bishop to h6, or you can play after rook to f6, of course, some ideas like finally maybe knight to e5. Then of course if you take, then it's not so good because you lose this one. So that's why black can never really take out the pawn on d4. That's also the main issue. But here after move knight to e5, maybe knight to e5, d takes e5. Here it's again a much better position for white. The position is open with we have the bishops on the board. Rook to d1 will happen in the near future. This bishop will get developed on to e3, so it's again a pleasant game. But after move knight to e5, we see that Nepo played now really brilliant move. He took first, bishop takes e5. He gave up the bishop, but for a really great compensation of a square, because after d takes e5, now this knight comes into the game. Here Magnus missed, I think, some tactics, and now knight to b3 is going to happen, attacking here the bishop on c1. Here Magnus Carlsen plays now knight to d6, attacking the bishop on b7, but Nepo plays the correct move, plays now the fork on the bishop and the rook. Here you have problems, you have to defend your bishop, and Magnus Carlsen finally played, I think, now a huge mistake. He plays now rook to b1, because you don't have to do that. You don't have to protect your bishop like this. You will lose the bishop or the rook anyway, so that's why I think you can play immediately the move bishop to e3. You don't have to lose your rook by losing a tempo, because in this particular line after move knight to b3, Magnus played now the rook to b1, and you see now knight takes c1, we have rook to c1, knight to c1, and rook to c1, but it's with the loss of tempo with the rook. Now in this particular scenario, let's go back. Here after move rook, instead of this move rook to b1, you can play the move bishop to e3. Bishop to e3 is at least bringing your bishop into the game. Okay, you can take knight takes a1, but now after rook takes a1, you can maybe take out this pawn, but that's not the problem, because you get really brilliant counter attack with the move bishop to c5. And here, if you try, of course, to play knight to d3 again, then we can play knight to b7. But these are really wild stockfish lines that I use, of course, in analysis with my stockfish at home. So it's not so easy to see everything on the board. You cannot really see all of the paths by the knight. So after move knight to b7, here if you for instance play with this rook, you will lose simply this rook. If you play here rook from f to c8, then of course we can simply play further with our pawn. Here we have the opportunity a takes b5, and even if you take here, then of course b takes c6, and suddenly it's, I think, a pleasant game here for white, although you're down the exchange. But so far at least we have attacked something, and we can notice also that the e6 is weak, then afterwards the c4 is a little bit weak. So the engine, for instance, in this particular scenario gives a 0.0 evaluation for both sides, but Magnus unfortunately played the worst move, I think. Here he played now the move rook to b1, which allows now, of course, to Nepo to take. But we can notice, I think, that Magnus lost the tempo with the rook to b1. You don't have to play it. Bishop to e3 is a further development. So here in the continuation, after move knight to c1, we have rook to c1, now rook to b8 here by Nepo. He realizes that he has problems here around the square b7, because there is always this threat a takes b5, c takes b5, and then you lose here maybe the bishop on b7. So here Magnus plays now the move rook to d1. He attacks, of course, the queen temporarily, indirectly, because the main threat is to move knight to b5. But here Nepo has, I think, multiple choices what to do. Nepo has now maybe the opportunity to get out of the range of the rook, and he can maybe get out of the range of the bishop. He played now the move bishop to a8, which was, in my opinion, again, a slight inaccuracy. Maybe a more positional approach is to move queen to e7. You can allow your opponent here actually to take a takes b5, but you can actually play c takes b5. I think Nepo missed this simple tactic, because if you want to take, okay, you can take knight takes b7, rook to b7, bishop to b7, and now queen to b7. I think this is a pleasant game for Nepo, because we have now here a pawn majority, really a clear pawn majority, 3 versus 1 on the queen side. It's a winning endgame. If, of course, black plays now the correct moves in this endgame, black is winning the endgame. So I think with this move, bishop to a8, Nepo missed the opportunity to go into a simplified line with the move queen to e7. I think this is a this was a brilliant opportunity for Nepo to take over really in the game. Here in the continuation, he played bishop to a8, and Magnus played now bishop to e4. Probably maybe 8x b5 here. Knight x b5 is also an opportunity to maybe create this discovered attack, but probably Magnus Carlsen didn't like this simplified line that is coming out of this tactic, because again queen to e7 will happen, then you play knight to d6. But now I think with the rook to b4, Magnus probably sensed this position that it's not so complicated anymore. Here Nepo can maybe simplify things. That's why I think Magnus choose to play this bishop to e4 line, because he realized that here of course you can play maybe something like, I don't know, knight to c4, but now with the move c5, I think that black has solved now all of the position problems. Finally we can trade off the light square bishops, and I think Magnus sensed it. He played when it comes to computer evaluations, he played a slightly worse move, bishop to e4, but we can agree that this move bishop to e4 is complicating things much better than this idea knight to b5. The knight to b5 is of course tempting, but it's not really from a human's eye the best move, because here with the move bishop to e4 still we have our threat knight to b5, so Magnus is staying with the threat, but now he creates another threat. There is always this kind of attack with queen to h5, maybe queen to c2. We can attack here really the light squares, because we can notice now that black is here really a lack of defenders. Black doesn't have piece defenders, so there are only 2 pawns in front of the king, and in the near future we can expect maybe a rook lift, rook to d4, rook to h4. Then it's getting very tricky to defend this position. When it comes to computer evaluations, I have to say it's a 1.5 evaluation here for black. So if for instance Stockfish played now the game, Stockfish would probably win the game here from black's perspective, because Stockfish would find of course the best next attacking or defensive move. But here from a human's eye, suddenly you don't like so much the position, because you see there are not so many defenders. You can maybe make many mistakes if you for instance play something like h6, then something like bishop to b1 happens, bishop to e4, and suddenly you could get checkmated. So these are the tiny little things that I think bothered now in the continuation. Nepo here in the continuation, he has now again several options. Of course you cannot play c5, that's the main issue, because we will simply take now. You cannot trade off the bishops anymore here in the continuation. After rook takes a1, then you get this one 8x b5, and see in the near future we can take out this one. The knight is very well placed, controlling also the b5 square, so far c5 is not an option here. So what you could do after move bishop to e4 is also to play here b takes a4, but now the game becomes really wild, because there is now a wild, sick, brutal tactic that probably Nepo was scared of. Here you have the opportunity to do this. That's the beauty of this move bishop to e4. As I said, from a human's eye, this move bishop to e4 is complicating more than this move knight to b5, because the knight is still there, and now you have to take king to h7, queen to h5, you have to play king to g8, and now this is the move rook to d4. As I said, this rook lift causes now many problems, and you have to bring now the queen here into defense. But now after rook to h4, queen to h4, and now queen to h4, but now rook to b2, and I think still this is complicated to play here for Magnus Carlsen. The evaluation should be about equal, but I don't like white position anymore. I think the attack is a little bit splashed, and the knight is simply far away from the action. Now c5, c3, c2, I don't know, maybe here rook battery on the b file, maybe rook on d8. So I would love to play now, I think, the game here from black's perspective, because the only thing that white is hoping for in this particular position is maybe to get the draw. So that's why here I think maybe this move b takes a4 is also an opportunity. But what I like the most about this position is again this calm move instead of this b takes a4 is again this move queen to a7. I simply like this line to get the queen further into the defense, and I think this should be the best defensive move here for Nepo. Even if you try something like, I don't know, queen to h5, then g6 should be also an opportunity, or maybe even g5. I think solves now all of the position problems. g6 is more riskier, I think, because after bishop to g6, h takes g6, then queen to g6 is happening. You have to cover with the queen, but now you lose this one. If you cover with the rook, then you get this one. For instance, you can get also this kind of a tactic. But actually here, as I said, instead of this g6 move, you can always play the move g5 and hope for the best. I think this is a position that black should hold. Meanwhile, we can push. But here Nepo, as I said, we have the opportunity. Bishop b takes a4, queen to e7, c5. We have seen it's not such a good an opportunity, because we'll simply take and then you lose the b5 pawn. Now Nepo played a really a bad move. He played the move c3, and he was hoping for after Magnus takes, maybe here b takes c3, that he could actually take b takes a4 and maybe create a passer. And when that happens, of course, then many pieces of whites are deflected simply to the queen side, and then you have to suddenly protect this pass pawn. But Magnus played now a very interesting idea, queen to c2. Here in the continuation we have now g6. The problem is now you cannot sacrifice anymore here with bishop takes g6, because you get this one, c takes b2. Now this was the tricky part of Nepo's variation, because now when you retreat with the bishop to e4, then finally b takes a4, and look at this, now you have the supported pass pawn. This was Nepo's idea, but of course after move g6 Magnus didn't sacrifice anything here. He played now first b takes c3, and after b takes a4, now queen to a4. Now suddenly Magnus Carlsen, I think, has equalized finally the game. Still, this tactic is working on the d-file, so you have to retreat with your queen. Here in the continuation, Nepo tried rook from f to d8, and here Magnus of course played rook to e1 in order to continue the pressure here around the square a7. So it's, from an engine perspective, again an equal game, but really wild things happen. So you see there were rook sacrifices, there were inaccuracies, mistakes, blunders really by both sides. So this is really a sharp Catalan game so far. Really brilliant game played by both sides. So after rook to a1, of course Magnus Carlsen is attacking the a7 pawn, but actually it's not so easy to attack the position. You don't want to trade off the queens. When the queens are off the board, then the game becomes more and more simplified. Then the meaning of being up the exchange is, I think, too much to handle here for white. So that's why after rook to a1 here, Nepo plays the correct idea, plays c5. Finally he wants to trade off the light for bishop. He wants to simplify games, and as I said, again Magnus doesn't want to trade off the queens, plays queen to c4, attacks simply the e6 weakness. So in the continuation we have now bishop to e4, we have knight to e4. Very tricky move here by Magnus. He wants to create a fork on f6, so also queen to d5 is not working. You would love, of course, to get rid of the queens, but again knight to f6 is happening, so you cannot trade off the queens, you cannot simplify the game. So after move knight to e4, here rook king to h8, and now finally knight to d6. Again here played by Magnus. He's cementing the knight further, and again we have now clear targets. Now we have a weakness here on a7, we have also the weak pawn on c5. So Magnus has now 5 pawns on the board, but Nepo has also 5 pawns on the board. But we can notice, I think, again, if Magnus maneuvers, for instance, this knight to f6, then if the queen comes into the game, then there are really tricky tactics possible here, maybe around the king. So that's why here after move knight to d6, here rook to b6 was played by Nepo, and now Magnus simply takes out this pawn. So now Magnus has 5 pawns, Nepo has 4 pawns, but of course still Nepo's up the exchange. Still an equalish game now for both sides. My engine at home again shows that it should be probably here a draw. So here rook to d8, rook to b8, rook from d to b8, of course threatening again to simplify the game by trading off the rook. So the simplification idea will come now many times in this particular endgame. So that's why Magnus gets out of the potential range, plays now king to g2. We have now a6, and now king to h3. Here in the continuation we have now the rook to c6 attacking the queen, queen to d4, and now king to g8. Maybe here rook to a8 would be slightly better in my opinion, finally threatening to push the pawn. This is a pass pawn, we have to say it. It's something that I think could bother white in the continuation of the game. Maybe from a computer evaluation, as I said, this should probably be a draw. But why don't you just a little bit annoyed when Magnus Carlsen with rook to a8, and you want to start to push a5, a4, a3. When that happens, of course, then your hands start to sweat, then you don't know what to do. So as I said, maybe rook to a8 would complicate things further here for white, but in the continuation after move queen to d4, here Nepo played king to g8, which is of course a slightly more passive move, but it's an improving of the king position. You want to have your king secure, so that's why it was, I think, understandable for Nepo why he played the next couple of moves like this, because he missed his tactics. He knows that something went wrong here for him. He had a winning opportunity against the world champion with the black pieces. Now he probably just wants to settle down and get a draw. So here after move king to g8, c4 played by Magnus, we have queen to c7, queen to g4, again attacking the e6 weakness. We have now rook to d6. Finally Nepo had enough of this very annoying knight on d6, of this octopus knight, and then after e takes d6 we have queen to d6, and now really tricky move here by Magnus. He played now the move c5, but this move c5, although it's tricky, it's a deflecting move, deflecting the queen from the square e6. It's probably a drawish line again, maybe here in order to spice things up, king to g2, a little bit slightly more complicated. I think this line with king to g2, staying with the pieces on the board, because now at least you're protecting the f2 pawn. You see now why is it important to protect your f2 pawn, because for c5 the game is pretty much one-sided, because you have to play now this line, queen to e6. After king to g7 you have only one chance, you want to take of course the pawn. The problem is now black cannot defend this position easily and cannot simplify the game. Queen to f2 is not working. You cannot take the pawn, because here Magnus had prepared this one, queen to e5 with a fork here, king to h6, and now even if we take after queen to f5, you don't want to play king to g2, because then after queen to d5 it leads into perpetual. The only good move here that wins the game for white is the move g4. Now after queen to f3, of course we can cover with queen to g3. Pardon me, here you have to play king to h4, then of course after this one we can cover here with the move queen to g3, and it should be probably a winning game here for Magnus. So as I said, here after move rook to h6, you cannot also do this one, you cannot do queen to c8 in order to simplify the game by trading off the queens. Here rook to a7 would be the continuation, and then with rook to d7 we're cutting off here the connection. The problem is now the king is a little bit naked here around the square h6, so that's why this is not also a good defensive idea. But Nepo played now the correct move. He played now rook to f8, attacking further the f2 pawn, but also getting the rook a little bit closer to the king, where of course the rook can protect the king. So here after move rook to f8, here f4 was played by Magnus Carlsen, improving simply this backward pawn. And now finally Nepo found this good defensive strategy with queen to f5. Now he managed to finally trade off the queens, and here after queen to f5, rook to f5, this should probably be a draw, because if maybe this f pawn would be somewhere else, maybe on the c file, b file, if this would be maybe a passed pawn, then probably white should in some occasions have to could have maybe winning position. But now with the 3 versus 2 on the same side, where still the pawns have to be traded maybe on the f file, on the g file, this should be probably a theoretical draw if you play of course the endgame correctly here from black's perspective. So that's why here Magnus tried rook to a7, king to g8, king to g4, now rook to b5. Very good move here by Nepo. Never ever allow this king to come on h6. If that happens, then of course it's game over. You don't want to invite your opponent's king into the game, so that's why you have to cut off here the 5th rank. So that's why Magnus plays still some tricky ideas. He wants still to win the game. He wants now to cut off the 5th rank by playing rook to e5. That's exactly what happens. Rook to e5. He wants to move up his king closer, and now Nepo realized that at least he has to protect his 7th rank. So now here in the continuation we have h4. We have king to g7, and now h5 here by Magnus Carlsen. What he's trying to do is maybe get this position, g takes h5, then king to h5. Then suddenly you see we have 2 connected pawns. This is a pass pawn, so the evaluation is 1.5 here for white. So this should probably again be a draw, but it's not so easy again to play this endgame maybe from black's perspective. So that's why what black needs to do is just wait, and that's exactly what Nepo did here. He played king to h6. If we want to take, then of course every trades of pawns is favorable for black. Then the game becomes more and more simplified. Then again it's a drawish position. So here after move king to h6, here's Magnus still try to spice it up the game here with king to h4, because again you don't want to take, of course, with g takes h5. Here you don't want to complicate things. So here after move king to h4, you don't want to take. There are good defensive moves here, rook to f7 and also rook to a1, getting the rook maybe behind the king. These are the main defensive ideas here that you can play. So again, as I said, this endgame should be probably a draw. So after king to h4, here in the continuation, finally rook to a1 was played by Nepo. He is going behind the king and the pawns, which is now a very, very important thing. And here Magnus Carlsen again tried to spice up the game. He's trying now to win this endgame, but it's not possible, because after rook to h1, king to g3, here Nepo finally undermines the pressure found here. Really a good move. You have to play the game like this. We have here rook to e6 now after king to g7. Magnus Carlsen again tried to complicate things. He tried to have this 2 pawns connected, but the Nepo again finds good defensive moves. Rook to g1, we have king to f2. Now he's getting towards the queen side here after rook to h6. Here Nepo has of course the opportunity to play rook to a4, king to f3, rook to a3, after king to f2 and rook to a4. Both players agree to a draw. Even if you try maybe different routes, if you try here king to g3, then still you get the check. And even if you try to get behind, the problem is this continuation. You still maybe can attack this one, and if you try perpetuals, then of course you have to play again here maybe if you try perpetuals, of course here again you get challenged. You can maybe get back with your king, but again you get checkmated. So but the best way actually here is to play rook to a1, even if for instance black loses a pawn here on the h file. Still of course rook to h1 simplifies the game, and this should be a draw. So if rook takes h5 happens, then you play simply king to g6. That's the most important thing. And even if you try to do check, then you get with the king here, and it should be again probably draw. The problem is you cannot take. That's the main issue, because here you will lose the rook on the h file. So as I said, after a couple perpetuals, king to f3, king to f2 has been played, and both players agree to a draw. So really wild game, really wild stuff. This was big chance for Nepo. I think in one particular moment he had some chances to win the game. Unfortunately for him, he missed probably some tactics. Magnus spiced up the game, Magnus complicated the game. So again, it seemed to me that both players are very well prepared with the black pieces. That's exactly, I think, when you maybe playing a match game like this, you're preparing more yourself with the black pieces than maybe with the white pieces, because you have to have, I think, good repertoire with the black pieces, in which you maybe trying to simplify the game going into drawish lines. Then with the white pieces, again, you're trying maybe to get the win. So you see in the first game, I think Magnus Carlsen was slightly better with the black pieces. Here Nepo was, in my opinion, much better with the black pieces. Unfortunately for him, as I said, he managed to only get a draw. And as I said, when it comes to psychology, you don't want to make a draw in this game. I think now it's Nepo that's a little bit down. Nepo had here really realistic opportunities to win the game, and we'll see now what will happen. So far, these two games were really brilliant. So, okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game. I really enjoyed it a lot. Really wild stuff in the Catalan. If you want to see also the first game, check out my analysis of our game 1 of this most important event in the chess world now. And if you want to maybe follow some other content on my YouTube chess channel, check out my commented chess games played by computers with some great games play Alpha 0, Lila 0, Stockfish, and many more. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.